introduce yourself and then you are next.
Yeah, hi, this is Krishan Sood. I'm with Civic Healthcare in the US. I've been involved with Brookings India in some capacity. I have two questions. One, we've had issues on estimating global growth, whether it's the IMF or the Federal Reserve or whatever. And is it a function of estimating global growth after financial crisis is different than global growth after typical recessions? And I just sense that we've all, because there's this whole deleveraging process and so on that takes time. So have we had the right framework in terms of estimating growth and then having to cut it every 6 months?
Estimating, you mean projecting?
Projecting,
okay.
yeah. So is that the criteria? And then the second point was on Sujit's point on income inequality. See, I think the point that's being missed is that the US is not, in the current environment today, is not thinking about global inequality. It's thinking about US inequality. And in fact, the points that Trump makes is, look, Mexico is getting rich on us and China is getting rich on us. So I think to look at it on a global basis is probably a mistake today. It may be a good thing strategically that there's more wealth or less instability and so on, but from an economic standpoint, my sense is that people are more concerned about should US policy help inequality in the US versus the rest of the world.
American people.
And I think Europe too, and I think the world's sort of becoming more internally focused than it was. So, but that's just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Vipul Chatterjee from Cuts International. I have two quick points and questions. First, we all know that there are many benefits of economic reforms. There are costs too, but I'm not going into those details. But there is one particular benefit of economic reforms which our policymakers or our politicians, they do not talk about often, which is about the enhancement of consumer welfare. I'm glad that Maurice has spoken about it, though in passing, Dr. Valla has also spoken about it, though indirectly in terms of, in the context of globalization and its impact on inflation. So my first question is, why our policymakers or politicians, they are not forthcoming or about talking about the consumer welfare enhancement impact of economic reforms? My second question is about China. As on today, the per capita income in China in nominal term is about 14% of that in the United States. In PPP term, it is about 26%. As per the aspiration which has been described by the Chinese leadership, by 2050, it is expected to be, in nominal terms, 60% of the per capita income of the United States, and maybe at par with the United States in terms of purchasing power parity. So my question is, if that happens, that huge increase in per capita income in China, both in nominal term as well as in PPP term, what would be its impact on the Western or Anglo-Saxon model of democracy?
Two quick questions. One is to build on your China slide about spillover effects for Asia and to link that up with Shankar's observation about locomotives. This may be a little geeky, but can you share with us the way you and the fund have started to think about how a China or an India impacts on global growth, by which I mean the exposed way of thinking about it is in terms of the current account, that basically global demand is affected by net exports, as it were. But you seem to be describing all kinds of other channels as well, through commodity markets, through gross exports. So when we think about the implications for the global economy of Indian growth, just help us think about what mechanisms you people now focus on rather than just net exports. And the second point is about the feel bad factor that the MD has been talking about, too long, too mediocre. It's part of this kind of maybe Asia-influenced half-full perspective. I mean, US labor markets are pretty tight. German labor markets are pretty tight. German labor markets are pretty tight. So is ultimately the issue stagnation in wages rather than, as it were, conventional unemployment, or is it just that the fact that the participation rate in the U.S. is down? So, as you guys, shape the messaging, what are you most worried about?
We've talked quite a lot about the United States and especially China, but the other two locomotives, if I may use Shankar's language, for the global economy used to be Europe and Japan. Now, I wonder, it may not be there in WEO, but from a medium-term perspective, what is the thinking in the fund about the prospects of these two other very important drivers of...
This is my favorite sloganeering. So, Maurice, please bear with me. When the US grows at 0%, it produces 17 million new cars. Imagine this demand for steel and other things. When India grows at 9%, it's 3 million new cars. So, this growth number, that's why I made the point about 2.2%. So, even 0% US growth is 17 million new cars.
The projection optimism, I think we did forecast an upgrade when the oil price plummeted, and the line from the fund was that there would be a shot in the arm to the world economy, and we've been living that down ever since. Part of the problem is that I think we and again, it's not just our forecasts. Look at any professional forecasters. Interpreted the growth from mid-90s to mid-2000s as something that was potential, and there was probably an element of froth there that was not sustainable, and so we've been learning that potential growth is much lower. So for the US, for example, it's true that we're projecting 2.2% for 2017, but we've downgraded the long-run potential growth to 1.8, which is lower than what we thought it was. So there is this fall in potential, fall in productivity, which I think also to some degree answers the question of why when output gaps are narrowing, we still worry. It is because output levels are much lower, because productivity is much lower, and so wage growth has been much lower. And we are beginning to see some political ramifications of this. And this is related to the inequality point that I'll come back to. It is funny, and Arjit made this point that this is not the 1930s. It's simply not the 1930s. Yet some of the political pressures we're seeing are, in the rhetoric, it really is reminiscent of the 1930s. I mean, a senior German official I talked to on Monday morning said, this really, some of this stuff really sounds like our dark times. And it is scary. And why, so what's the excuse? And I think that similarly to the 1930s, there's a feeling among a segment of the population, generally older, that the world they knew is slipping away, and this is partially a function of globalization. The Brexiteers said we have to take our country back. Donald Trump, in a speech yesterday, said we have to take our country back. Like, from who, right? It's a kind of a rhetorical question I'm asking, but I think the answer tells you a lot about where we are in a couple of countries. I think the French, the National Front, wants to take the country back. The Poles want to take the country back. And it's not all explained by economic determinism. To some degree, I'm a little bit optimistic for the future because, I feel that the younger generations are less attached to this way of thinking. But, the current older generation can do a lot of damage between now and when they depart from the scene. So that's what we're, trying to stop. On trade, the big thing that we found is that it's really the fall in investment that's having a huge effect. The weak investment, almost everywhere. It's true in India, it's true in the US, it's true in Europe. It's true in commodity exporters that have an overhang of past investment. So this is a really big element of it. And you know, you know, what does it presage about globalization? Well, you know, to some extent it's cyclical. But you know, there does seem to be a backlash in some countries, and we didn't find this as the major factor, but that could become worse going forward. Labor-saving technical progress. This is a huge issue, and it certainly had an effect on income distribution to date. But I think we need to think about it through the inequality lens, and I'll come back to Surjit's point about inequality. You know, this could be an even bigger driver of inequality going forward. And you know, there's a discussion about robots and automation, and it seems to me that the major issue is going to be like who owns those robots, right? If everyone has equal endowments, then it's a balanced productivity change. Everyone benefits. But I think we do need to take this seriously in terms of our approaches to inequality in the advanced countries, at least. Certainly in the United States, because the future could be very, very troublesome. World inequality trends. Surjit is absolutely right that there's a lot of very loose talk about this. And you really have to get pretty granular to not fall into inaccuracy, as he says. So if you sort of view the world as a collection of people, then it's inarguable that world inequality has fallen a lot. And that's largely driven by, I mean, China is the biggest driver, a lot of people there. India is a big driver, a lot of people there. So there's been a convergence process very notable for those countries. For many other emerging market countries, there's been almost no convergence in per capita incomes. It's a very patchy situation, and we may actually do a chapter in the next World Economic Outlook, just sort of trying to document this. What what is the importance of this? Well, it's not really important within any given country's political system what's happening to world inequality. And it's important to guys like us who have worked at the World Bank and the IMF, because we like the idea that there is convergence in the world economy and that people in poor countries have rising standards of living, at least in some poorer countries. Within countries, the inequality trends are somewhat mixed. The U.S. is a big case. UK. You look at a country like France, not much has happened. But a lot also depends on how you measure inequality. There are different ways you can measure it. If you're looking at a Gini coefficient, that may give very different answers from looking at the income share of the top 1%. And politically speaking, people do care about the income share of the top 1%. And if that's rising a lot, it may be that median wages are going nowhere. And it may be that most of the distribution of income doesn't look that different, but people are frustrated. And that's, I think, what you see in a lot of countries. On Indian growth, I will take up your points with the India desk. I suspect there will be further upgrades, so I can't predict that. And part of it may be agriculture, part of it is a lot of optimism about structural reforms, particularly the general sales tax. The disinflation question is really interesting, and I think you're onto something, Surjit. We don't remember that much that in the early 2000s there was a huge panic about disinflation, particularly in the U.S. And Ben Bernanke wrote a paper called "Can It Happen Here?" It being Japanese-style disinflation, and there were really severe pressures, and part of it was no doubt related to globalization, to the import surge from China. But those imbalances also helped lead to a big run-up in commodity prices starting around 2003, 2004, which may have somewhat disguised some underlying disinflationary pressures. So the trend has been downward since the 80s as countries progressively put into place inflation targeting regimes. Following a debt crisis, financial crisis such as we've had, countries have moved to the zero lower bound, and they've entered a situation where it may be much harder to return to normality than it would be from a situation of excessive inflation, because you can always raise interest rates, you can't cut them. And so there's no doubt there's an element in where the advanced countries are that is, makes it kind of an attractor. It makes it hard to escape from. And that's why, we think monetary policy has to remain accommodative, but we also recognize that the toolbox is being pushed to its extensive margin. Consumer welfare and reforms. This is a very important point. In the chapter I didn't go through from the WIA, we did look at some particular consumer-oriented reforms, which can be very stimulative for the economy, but there isn't enough emphasis on that. Last spring in the US, President Obama directed all federal agencies to look for areas where consumer-oriented reforms could be put into action on the grounds that these both can spur demand, spur innovation, and also have favorable distributional consequences. So I agree with you that this is something that should be more emphasized. On growth spillovers, Suman, we tend to look at the direct trade channels. We've been looking in the context of China, particularly at the commodity channels, and also at sort of asset price contagion. So these are the main things we look at, but we also sort of put these things into general equilibrium models where you can also look at impacts on global interest rates and things like that. So the mechanisms can be many and pretty complicated. And in this spillover analysis I showed you, we tried to isolate these channels in a way that might be a little bit artificial because they all, sort of work together. Europe and Japan.